With cyber becoming a more active arena for military and criminal activity with specific targets in mind, many feel that where real-world military or criminal activity can sadly result in collateral damage, such should be expected in the cyber domain as well. Cyber decision makers need to be aware of this danger and begin discussing what can be done to prevent or at least minimize the chances of innocent third parties becoming digital collateral damage. This will be a discussion about what are the real threats we should be concerned with and what steps decision makers should be taking both in terms of operational doctrines and even legislation to minimize collateral cyber damage. Our moderator will be Brendan Curry, and I'll now let Brendan take it away.
Well, thank you, Captain. Originally planned for our moderator was to be Mr. Jeff Carr of Taya Global. He had a family medical emergency that's prevented him from joining us today, so I'm stepping in for him today. So today we have two good panelists today. We have Kurt Baumgartner. He is senior security researcher for North America on global research and analysis by Kaspersky Labs. And we have Mr. Doug DePeppe, who's the principal and co-founder of the Western Cyber Exchange, as well as I2 Information Security. And what we wanted to do was, when we were talking about putting this panel together, cyber operations, cyber warfare, the terms and phraseologies that get bandied about in this area, in this arena, got me to thinking about, just like in other operations, whether it be law enforcement or military, there's always a risk or a worry about collateral damage, innocent third parties being negatively impacted by activities that take place. And so I was thinking it might be interesting to have some people get together and discuss what that could mean in the cyber domain with respect to collateral damage, and what, if anything, we as an industry can do to take steps to preclude that, whether it be in terms of best practices, or is it something that we're going to need to look at? We had Congressman Meehan earlier today. We're going to hear from Congressman Ruppersberger later today. Is this going to be an issue that we're going to need decision makers in Washington to grapple with as well? So without further ado, I'll turn it over to the distinguished panels to start talking.
All right. Well, hello. My name is Kurt Baumgartner. I'm a part of the global research and analysis team at Kaspersky. We've done quite a bit of work in the way of Stuxnet, DePeppe, Flame. Basically, the Tilde platform is what we called it. And sort of the quintessential example here of collateral damage when it comes to these sorts of operations, of course, is Stuxnet. And, in my opinion, the worming techniques and the spreading capabilities of that worm is a good example of poor coding when it comes to delivering a cyber weapon that can cause quite a bit of collateral damage. We saw at least 100,000 infections after the initial announcement in June of 2010. And we haven't, I'd say this past year, we haven't been looking at it a whole lot in terms of in-depth research, although it continues to spread. It's all over the globe, it's all over the map still, and this is years later. So I talked to one of my colleagues who was working at Virus Blockada at the time. His name is Sergey Ulasin, and he's the guy who really identified Stuxnet in the wild. And I asked him if he ever figured out what the blue screens of death were. So the reason Stuxnet was uncovered in the wild was because customers of this Belarusian company were seeing machines crashing and in loops endlessly. Now, with something like that spreading to 100,000 machines rather rapidly and fairly unreliably, it does pose not only a performance and stability issue, but it does create some risk for global infrastructure providers, and I guess that's where I'm going to start, I guess, focusing over the next 30 minutes here after I give Mr. DePeppe a chance to speak as well. So, thanks.
So my name is Doug DePeppe. Let me give you a little bit of background so you understand where I'm coming from in these quick remarks. My background is cyber law. I also do consulting practice with IT information security and the Western Cyber Exchange, which is a Cyber Huntsville, Cyber City, USA sort of instrumentality here in Colorado Springs and New Mexico. So when I hear collateral damage, the term, what comes to mind for me initially is the military application of that, right? The Desert Storm, war in the Gulf, targeting considerations, what's the law of armed conflict or law of war considerations. And I want to start there because there's a lot of media, sound bites, articles, discussion outside of media as well about cyber operations, terms like proactive defense that you just heard General Vautrinot mention, hackback. So there's a lot of these terms that are being thrown about, and I would submit a little bit loosely in terms of the underpinnings to be allowed or be authorized to engage in this activity. So I want to give you a 100,000-foot level perspective on the frameworks that we need to consider against this kind of, I would describe it sometimes as loose talk. So, because I think we're in a period of revolutionary change. And whenever there's revolutionary change afoot that affects individual rights, government interests, there's an imbalance, and then the imbalance has to be corrected so that we have law and order, so that commerce can progress, so that societies can be stable. So if you think of frameworks as the raging horde of Genghis Khan and implementing mechanisms to respond to that, the Barbary Pirates episode, and many other pieces of history where we've had an imbalance. And that's where we are right now with the internet, right? So it wasn't very long ago where we still had dial-up. In a dial-up internet, you don't really have robust hacking, right? It takes too long to penetrate. Now that with the ubiquitous of the internet and devices and the speed, now it's become a advantageous mechanism for cybercrime, for state actors to pursue their strategic goals, and so on. And so we have an unsettled period again. We have a period of revolutionary change. So now we're hearing through the media that, well, we need to respond. We can't just be hacked. When you saw the billions of dollars that General Vautrinot put up, that's a problem, right? And so when we have this imbalance, then there's talk of, well, we have to respond. Fair enough. But let's make sure that we know the frameworks that we should respond in, or if the frameworks are insufficient, which you hear about a lot, that's fine. Let's have that discussion about whether the frameworks are sufficient and change the framework. So, and I'll stop in a second, but let me just set out two core frameworks that we need to think about. One is civil society. So when we're hacked, what are the mechanisms and the authorities that organizations can use or are restricted by, laws, criminal laws, and so on. And then when government actors participate. So when government actors, there are, whether it's the law of armed conflict, mutual assistance treaties on the law enforcement side, and so on, that's how you transact or you correct imbalances. And I will add one final point. There's a lot more I want to talk about, but I'll hand it back to Brendan and Kurt. But is that the problem presented by the internet under those two spheres, civil society and government, is that generally speaking, there are exceptions. You need to have attribution. To go after someone, you have to know who did it, because if you go at it willy-nilly without rigor, then you get into the issue of collateral effects, and collateral effects on the civil side could raise liability concerns if you attack the wrong person, right, or wrong entity, and on the government side, you could violate law of armed conflict. So I'll talk some more, but I'll pass it back. two examples?
Okay. So I'd like to, I guess I'd like to give two concrete examples, recent examples, where attribution would be a problem, would be an immediate problem. You're trying to figure out who did this, who's behind this event, what actor. And one of the recent, well, there's a term going around that's been leaked out, I guess, going around called watering hole attacks. And they've been going on for some time, but the more recent ones made Apple, Twitter, Facebook, a number of other corporations victims of these watering hole attacks. So in the past, we've just been calling them strategic web compromises. In order to get after your true target, you hit the sites that they normally spend time on. So if you want to hit a iPhone developer, you compromise the website that the iPhone developer is going to participate in. The iPhone developer visits that site, and for the most part, you know what that person is going to be using. You can deliver appropriate exploits to compromise the system and take control of the system. There are some very easy reactions when those incidents are immediately uncovered, and attribution at that point is fairly difficult. The indicators at the time suggested that it was not a common or well-enumerated actor, but again, attribution is something that needs to be done quickly, and mistakes in these cases are difficult. Even the attack itself was not immediately clear as to who was being attacked. That's sort of the nature of watering hole attacks. You don't know exactly who's being attacked until you do quite a bit of review, which takes some time, of the victims. Victims are not always forthcoming. They often don't even know that they've been attacked. So not only is attribution a problem, but identifying the true victims of the watering hole attacks themselves can be an issue.
Gotcha. We're already starting to get some questions. I'll throw this open to both of you. Does the existence of collateral damage in cyber operations play a role, or should play a role, in how the U.S. government thinks about deterrence, or how industry should think about cyber deterrence?
I think absolutely. So generally speaking, and I'll need to caveat it with the general rule. So if the criminal law is that if you access an unauthorized access of a network, technically it's called a protected computer, but if you unauthorized access a network, and that's under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and there's actually talk of expanding that to an unauthorized purpose, which means that even if you have authorization, if you're doing something that's outside your scope, then even that could be harmful, which is really problematic. But if you access a network without authority, that's hacking domestically. So how does the U.S. government structure a framework to enable corporations or the government to defend itself when the scaling of the government doing it by itself is probably problematic, right? I mean, there are a lot more adversaries out there than there are U.S. cyber forces. So if you want to commission the private sector to help, then what kind of a mechanism needs to be put in place for licensing or to control as best you can the activities of those who have been licensed? Right now, there is, generally speaking, one authority to be commissioned to be a contractor serving for the government to engage in cyber operations. That licensing, if you will, it's not really licensing, but that authority probably needs to be expanded, but it's got to be expanded within a framework that can be controlled. Because while you want to have, and I think that would have a deterrent effect, but it's a slippery slope. As soon as other nations find out that the perception being that whether we control it in a rigorous manner or not, the perception globally will be that the United States is engaged in cyber blackwater, right? We're just licensing contractors to go around and hack back. That is a huge slippery slope, right? Then we get into a cyber arms race, which we probably have already, but that opens up Pandora's box of the Wild West, anything goes.
I guess I'd look at the question from the defender's side and of the industry. You know, for defenders to make a distinction as to who they are defending from is next to impossible in this in the current architecture we have. So yes, on the cyber OffSec side, there are legal frameworks. There's all sorts of things that can be implemented to create limitations and sort of put bounds around activities. But when it comes to the defender side, it becomes all the more difficult. And basically, it is what it comes down to is it's not the job of the industry to identify exactly who they're defending from. Although that's not, I'm not including the hackback portion of the industry. I don't consider that defensive at this point.
Let me just mention something else. When we talk about deterrence, you know, that connotes a national approach, and that's certainly necessary and appropriate. But if you look systemically at the internet and its functionality and how it's being, its useful purposes are being circumvented by adversaries, there are some systemic deficiencies in the registration system of the DNS, right, where there are controls on how you get registered, but it's not really a robust, dynamic process to take offline websites that their sole purpose in many respects is to propagate botnets and to propagate fraud. And so we need to have a better mechanism in working with ICANN to address that deficiency. And I'll give you an example. I mentioned earlier about licensing and what the private sector can do. A good example of a non-systemic, the systemic approach would be to ICANN, but then having implementing organizations like what Microsoft and Dell are doing with takedowns, right? So they're using legal mechanisms to protect their legitimate property interests, namely copyright and other interests, to serve complaints on these fraudulent name and registrants, and they take them down. Now, there are a lot of other issues because sometimes, and not sometimes, always, you take down innocent parties as part of that, but that is a presently an ad hoc approach that could be made more systemic and more robust so that we start taking down the mechanisms that are being used via the internet, right, the internet system, to attack us that we don't really have a systemic approach to deal with right now.
What would you, obviously everyone here is pretty well versed in cybersecurity, but for the average person, the average American, what do you think they are most vulnerable to in terms of collateral damage in a cyber attack? Would it be financial loss or being deprived of privacy or civil liberties?
Let's see. So, if you're going to limit the discussion to collateral damage, then we're sort of moving away from mass exploitation, where the general public is the target, and financial cybercrime and fraud is the goal. When you talk about, at least in my opinion, when you're talking about collateral damage and limiting the discussion to collateral damage, people are getting hit a lot with watering hole techniques, watering hole schemes. Java is often implicated. It used to be Flash. Last year, Flash and Reader seemed to be at the top of the list, but this year, I'd say in the past year, Java has been heavily used in client-side attacks. And in attacks that it's difficult to identify the actor, and the motivations would seem more to lend itself to that of a state-motivated attack. Those individuals really, I guess the majority of them end up with backdoors on their system. Sometimes their accounts end up used as sources of spearfish. So they end up furthering the attack, and possibly their contact lists are harvested, examined for value as far as who they communicate with and when. But generally, in the sense of collateral damage, either it's a performance issue, a stability issue. When they're not a target, I don't know that privacy, I mean, of course, their privacy has been violated. I mean, their system is compromised. But if you're looking for more severe problems, I'd go with their resources are being misused by the attackers to further the attack, and they end up with performance and stability issues.
I agree, Kurt. I think the question, I don't want to minimize the impact on private citizens or to say that, you know, but I think that the notion of we need to raise the hygiene and protecting everyday users is part of that. But passing responsibility on the users to raise the overall hygiene is a losing proposition. You know, the structure to protect users needs to be at a higher level, whether it's ISPs or the internet, you know, the ICANN approach I mentioned. Ultimately, I agree with Kurt that their users are not at such a high risk of loss as much as their systems are being utilized as to be part of botnets where they're, unbeknownst to them, being are part of an attack on someone else that's a bigger target.
Gotcha.
Another example of that would be during some of the comments crew attacks over the past couple of years. They have compromised websites all over the world. One of them happened to be a New York City Italian restaurant. And a lot of compromised systems would end up phoning back to this website looking for a specific comment with a specifically encoded string in the HTML, buried in the HTML for further instructions. And when you look at it, I mean, for a small business to be hacked like that, the owner of the business actually got a little excited about it, said any publicity is good publicity. And, you know, for a small business like that, it's not as severe. They will have to spend money cleaning up their system or have to find help in order to identify the vulnerability, clean up the system. Who knows what else is being stored on that system or uploaded by the comments crew during their attacks to those systems. So those are definitely costs to small business owners and average citizens, but it's not as severe.
Gotcha. Doug, this may be more of a question for you. You know, what, from a public policy standpoint, what victims of collateral damage in cyber operations, what avenues for recourse do you think they should be afforded to them, or what does appropriate punishment, if attribution can be made, look like?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think that, you know, there's not a direct answer to that. We are in a stage now in the change afoot where we and not just the U.S. but globally have to build capacity. We've got to provide the mechanisms so that when law enforcement in the U.S. looks to assist, to do a takedown or to you know, complaint as you described comes up to the system and they want to take action, and the server someplace overseas, which has probably been set up in that location strategically because of the lack of capacity, so that when law enforcement goes into that country and seeks assistance and there's not capacity to collaborate and to engage in law enforcement within the site where that server is located. So there's a major problem with capacity globally in terms of law enforcement capacity, more frameworks on the law of armed conflict side, and so on. But related to that question, and I wanted to mention it before because I didn't want to leave it hanging when I started off with the civil framework and the government framework, is that there's this notion that because we don't have attribution, we don't have capacity, it's unsatisfactory and we've got to do something. The one framework on the government side, law of armed conflict, is there's state responsibility. So if a country is allowing activity to occur that is harmful to other nations in the global order, they're failing in their obligations, and it may be permissible to take unilateral action. So what we can do is start exercising some of these authorities that exist in current frameworks and apply them. And if they don't work adequately, then we adjust. But there are the mechanisms in place that we're just not utilizing. So state responsibility is one of them.
Is there been opportunities for the United States to lead by example?
Well, we created the internet. So yeah, I think that we haven't in all of our many strategy and implementation documents going back at least 10 years. It's commonly said that we've never defined cybersecurity. So we haven't defined the problem we're looking to solve. Gotcha. And so, yes, there's all kinds of ways to lead by example, but I think we've got to engage in some problem solving, some core risk management to determine what the core problems are, how they work within the frameworks we have in place, and start changing or improving frameworks if necessary.
Gotcha. Kurt, this one is a little bit more technical in nature, so I'll hand it over to you. Will it ever be practical to implement a new secure operating systems and/or internet design? I know that's probably a big chew, but we got some time.
Let's see here. I'm going to start with secure operating systems. With every software design and development process, there are a number of trade-offs that need to be made: robustness, timeliness, and quality of code. Those three things are generally where you start with any engineering effort. With the expectations that devices and technologies can be added and removed from facilities or networks quickly and flexibly, there's a lot of complexity that gets added to the development processes, and somewhere these trade-offs need to be accepted. And they need to be accepted in favor of security, which has been lacking. I do think that for limited sets of applications, a secure OS would be valuable and interesting and worthwhile. For the general public that we've been speaking of, I don't think that it's as valuable. The general public wants features, wants to be able to do things with the technology they're buying, and security can limit that. So certainly in critical infrastructure environments, a more secure OS and certainly secure authenticated communications are desired and necessary, in my opinion. When you're talking about the architecture of the internet, there is a different set of goals than maintaining a critical infrastructure environment and protecting that. The flow of information and the freedom of information is one of those goals, and inhibiting that by creating a DNS registration process that requires identities that can be tracked down and dealt with in certain ways can suffocate the freedom of that information. So there it's a big question that I don't know that I can adequately address. There have been some solutions as far as separating things out, like I just mentioned with a secure OS. So in a critical infrastructure environment that has a limited use and a limited purpose, a secure OS may be appropriate and desirable. On the internet side of things and the network of networks, it may be desirable to limit communications for more critical communications, or to require encryptions or authentications of some sort for voting processes. But that can be handled privately. That doesn't necessarily need to continue as a public resource. So, when you're talking about it's just a bigger question.
Sure. Sure.
I'm not sure can be addressed here.
Sure. Doug, in some of Congressman Meehan's remarks earlier this morning and some of the other discussions this morning, and I'm sure we'll hear throughout the day, there's concern that the current statutes in place, either state and federal, are woefully behind in terms of trying to keep pace with the pace of innovation. Is it even feasible to think that lawmakers in the legal community and court systems could ever hope to keep pace?
So typically law is always behind, right? And so it's responding to an imbalance that I started out talking about. So it's always going to be behind. It's not going to typically solve, depending upon the genre we're talking about. I mean, there's criminal law or certain areas you specify a crime, and that's you can pretty well regulate it because you specify what the act is. But this is very big, very broad, and no law is going to solve it. But you have to put a framework in place. And so, for example, what's lacking right now, and the executive order and PPD 21 came out to try to address it because Congress wasn't able to act, is how do we engage in the integration between the public sector and the private sector, remaining true to our core values that private property has to be respected, and private property in the internet is 80% or more, right? So what kind of mechanisms that remain true to our core values can we put in place? Information sharing, public-private partnerships, these are all, and others are all good ideas that presently don't have the mechanisms, and surely Congress can act in that space. We'll see what happens with the president's issuances a month or so ago, and the studies that are afoot that will change things as well.
Gotcha. Kurt, here's a question. How does identity management play into non-attribution?
So identity management, like any technology, can aid in misdirection.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what this question's getting at. For example, in fairly recent targeted attacks, some of the newer defensive technologies use quite a bit of whitelisting, and some of them are more reliant on digital certificates and signatures than they should be. The identity, so identities can be stolen. For example, even Adobe's identity can be stolen. They maintain sort of a Fort Knox of their own in regards to their digital certificates, signing their malware, or signing their software used all over the globe, which in turn was used to sign some malware. And it was an APT tool set that Adobe certificates were used to represent the software as Adobe. Clearly, it was not to the incident investigators, but to the automated processes, it certainly was Adobe. I think that, yeah, identity management itself can be misused. There are always ways around it, unfortunately, or, well, with enough determination, there are ways around it, and there are ways to misuse it.
This is kind of a related question. How would you characterize the state of the art in characterizing and attributing cyber attacks? I mean,
oh, and let me back up 1 second. I just
right ahead.
realized one other point.
Sure.
So identity management is interesting when you talk about DNS, and you're trying to identify attackers and who is records. A lot of, there are privacy protection services that provide a lot of cover for illegal and, well, illegal activities. So managing your identity behind the veil of privacy management businesses can be very useful in helping cover and generally non-attribution activity, or trying to cover your activities, unfortunately. The guys who are doing attribution and the state-of-the-art attribution certainly can currently track back to individuals. I wouldn't call it altogether, like, entirely difficult. It can be done. A lot of the threat actors out there have been doing their work for years, and with quite a bit of investigation, especially on foreign forums and a lot of Google Translate use, you can identify individuals behind the attacks themselves. There seems to be a trail of crumbs with a lot of the attackers out there.
Interesting. Doug?
I wanted to follow up on an earlier comment, because I know that when I mentioned capacity building and global frameworks, it's hard to get your arms around the problem, and it's too sort of esoteric. So let me mention two things and then extrapolate. One, the risk of the slippery slope of media talking about cyber war and loose considerations of proactive defense. And we are at the most at risk, right? The West. We're the most connected. We have the most resources. We're losing the most money. So it is risky to open Pandora's box, probably more risky to us than anyone else. So we've got to think about that before we open up Pandora's box. Two, in concrete terms, look at North Korea and South Korea right now. I was thinking about 2 weeks ago about the attacks, the cyber attacks, and it occurred to me, you know, what if a terrorist were to start strategically hacking in an already inflammatory situation? And then a couple days later, you know, I read that Anonymous is hacking North Korea, right? So cyber can be used as a catalyst to, in terms of collateral effects, we can very easily go from a cyber conflict to a kinetic conflict, you know, that's could be substantial and deadly and harmful to a lot of folks' interests. So tying that back to why we've got to engage in capacity building. And it's happening. I mean, the UN, ITU, others, and what role can the U.S. play in helping promote capacity building? Whether the attack happened against North Korea or South Korea, politics, global, you know, geopolitics aside, et cetera, a country needs to be able to respond and have mechanisms to respond. And that attack, while it's from Anonymous, and I know it's DDoS, and it still starts from somewhere, right? And we talk about cloud computing, we have this amorphous idea. Okay, but there are servers somewhere that are playing a role. And we've got to have the framework to go after those servers. And the way and if ICANN doesn't respond quickly enough and put the frameworks in place, then the U.S. can go into mutual legal aid treaties, which are bilateral transactions, invest in capacity buildings ourselves so that we have the mechanisms to go after the servers where they exist to take them down. That's capacity building. That's how it ties into a situation like North Korea and South Korea and other places across the globe.
So another one for you, Doug. What efforts are underway to drive parity with respect to penalties between the physical theft of intellectual property and electronic theft?
What's the first part of the question?
Sure.
What are the
What efforts are underway to drive more parity in terms of penalties for the crime of physically stealing intellectual property versus electronically stealing? Or are we almost there?
I think that if you can articulate a loss in terms of valuing your intellectual property, you know, the laws are there. That's an intellectual property question. That's a litigation question. I think that you know, there may be. I'm not that boned up on it to say that they're satisfactory, but my sense is that they are. I think though that, and actually presently there's more litigation occurring that's sort of refining the case law. That when you're hacked, there is increasing, at least on the ACH fraud standpoint, case law developing as to who's responsible for that incident and whether it's the bank or whether it's the customer. The cases are split. But there's growing case law, and I think if you have loss, you just have to be able to prove what the value is, which is always a challenge in litigation. I'm not sure that we need any better resolution on how you establish value.
Gotcha. A question open for both of you. Over the past at least 20 years, we've seen in our military an increased focus and attention on precision-guided warfare to reduce collateral damage. How important, in terms of minimizing collateral damage, should our cyber warriors be concerned with?
All right. You know, so cyber warriors should be very concerned with collateral damage. You know, depending on the targets at hand, of course the damages, the unexpected and unintentional damages could potentially be quite large. So because there seems to be quite a bit of crossover between what is used by a civilian population and what would be used by a military population, what could be targeted. Let's say electrical gear is targeted in some manner, or in some way a network is targeted that helps support an operation. And from there, worming capabilities bring the payload back to the source or the origin country, or even within the target country, it ends up wiping out most of the electrical grid. You know, people depend on medical care and have all sorts of physical dependencies. You know, water treatment. There could be a lot of unintended damage.
So this is one where a framework's in place. Every weapon system in the military's arsenal undergoes a law of war review, believe it or not, before it's rolled out. Whether it's hollow rounds, tumbling bullets, and so on, every weapon and weapon system goes through a law of war analysis before it's rolled out. That said, how a piece of code or malware or other cyber weapon works its way across the network and how it may functionally operate, there's definitely some skill sets there in being able to correlate. So you correlate that weapon within the framework. There was on LinkedIn over the weekend an interesting, going back about a week, a discussion about multidisciplinary expertise as being especially needed in cyberspace. And I think this hones that point, because an ivory tower lawyer, a very technically oriented technician, and others in terms of risk and in terms of operations need to put their heads together, not on the law of war legality of the weapon, the cyber warfare weapon, but on its application, to be able to anticipate what the unforeseen impact is going to be and limit that, because you're required to under the law of armed conflict.
Throughout the discussion, we've been hearing terms, just a state actor or a non-state actor. Is there really a need to distinguish? And if so, why? And does the need for that demarcation inform how a government should respond to a cyber operation versus how a private entity should respond?
So some of you may have heard of the Talon Manual, which was a NATO commissioned group of law experts to try to bring the existing legal framework, how it should apply for cyber war. And there was not full consensus, but it's a starting point. One of the difficult areas is, as the question described, how does it is necessary to be a state actor? Where do non-state actors fit? I started out this conversation expressing my concern about the loose use of the word cyber war and similar. And I've even seen those who cast the Talon Manual as being the blueprint to enable anyone to engage in cyber war. And you couldn't be further from what that document is about. So the construct I set up, the two spheres, cyber war only applies, that's too strong, generally applies to state actors. Civil entities, if they engage in activities that would be aggressive, generally would fall under the criminal law. Now, just like we have with terrorism, there is a convergence point where it's not clear. Hacktivists, for example, is it crime? Are they engaged in national security? Should we treat them in one or the other? The framework exists to apply that, and one way of going about it is state responsibility. Don't worry about the attribution. Go after the server, take down the server, and then do forensic work and try to backtrack.
I guess on the technical side, defending against the two different categories of attackers, it becomes important because how long or how determined, how persistent the adversary may be becomes a big question. Some of the groups, however, that are as persistent and determined as you might expect from a state actor are probably, and this is where the attribution piece comes in and becomes problematic, are probably non-state actors. But how do you categorize them? Are they driven by state motivations? Are they simply facilitating or supporting other state groups, and maybe they're paid in some way or favors are handed out? I don't know. I guess I'm not in the attribution piece big enough to know that. But on the defender side, it's important to know, I think it's important to know who is coming after you, so you do have an idea of how much you need to invest in your defenses.
Here's an interesting question. As in normal kinetic conflict and there's collateral damage, oftentimes there's the need to physically rebuild those pieces of damage, roads, schools, bridges, whatever. What might the need to rebuild in a post-cyber conflict look like in terms of having to rebuild things that were damaged, that were basically collateral damage from a cyber conflict? What might that look like?
All right. When you're talking about a cyber conflict, I'm assuming you're talking about more state-sponsored conflict.
Sure.
Because in the commercial world, that would be highly irregular and unusual. To set aside potential kinetic, to set aside critical infrastructure and other targets like that, where a cyber attack could bleed into a kinetic event, I guess you'd call it, there probably would be a need to, well, a concrete example I'm thinking of is the attack, the 300 gigabit per second attack that was recently taken on Cloudflare, that was partnered with attacking the peers for the network where they were hosting quite a bit of their data in Europe. The configuration of the network equipment and the network equipment itself probably would not be heavily damaged in all likelihood. It could be. I'm sure there's a way to do it. What we've seen with, but in the case at least of the recent, say, DDoS attack, there is no permanent damage other than the requirements for reconfiguration and to disallow that disruption from occurring again. When you look at something like Shamoon or what Flame did, the wiping capabilities of these pieces of malware can be destructive in a sense. In South Korea, the banking system was recently attacked, and in that case, you have to rebuild. So there's restoration, there's cleaning of networks, and then there's another bigger issue that bleeds away from the computing resources themselves, and that's one of how are the identities that were pulled off of those machines going to be misused in the future.
Right.
So then you bleed off into other projects, I guess, that aren't necessarily IT focused.
Gotcha. Doug?
That's a big question. So I echo some of the comments by Kurt on examples. So you have Saudi Aramco, right? 30,000 pieces or devices destroyed or rendered useless. So you actually have infrastructure damaged or destroyed. About a year or so ago, it ended up not being what it was originally claimed, which was an attack on a water utility in Illinois. Nevertheless, there was damage. So, and there's other examples that if you go to the conferences of being able to attack industrial control systems. So it's pretty well established that and demonstrated that destruction of infrastructure, not just internet infrastructure, is possible. So then it gets into, to me, get the question, there's several questions that spin off of that. One scenario is, what if the domain name servers, the ICANN's infrastructure is attacked and destroyed, which I would call part of the global commons now. Who is responsible for recovery for something that used to be a Department of Commerce contract, right? ICANN. So what is that, a U.S. responsibility? Is that a UN responsibility? Is ICANN budgeted for that? And there was a lot of publicity about 2 months ago about ITU, International Telegraphic Union, supposedly taking over the internet, but because of standards they wanted to place upon ICANN. But arguably, depending upon what their agenda is, that is a role for ITU to start to addressing the resilience of ICANN. And then just domestically, if infrastructure is destroyed, if it's corporate owned, then that's going to be, generally speaking, the corporate responsibility. If it's widespread, then you get into government programs to help fund and recover. But an interesting question there related to, and I've been harping on this separately outside this forum, is what happens with the PPD 21 and the executive order and whatever comes out of Congress. If it's voluntary and a utility or critical infrastructure has extreme damage and they didn't follow voluntary best practices, are they liable to their customers? Third-party downstream effects, or are we going to see an onslaught of litigation? A lot of these questions are unanswered presently as to who is responsible for recovery and what kind of funding mechanisms are in place. That's something that Congress should probably think about.
Gotcha. Well, I think we're out of questions. Any final thoughts? Okay, good. Well, I want to thank you guys for joining us today, and I want to thank the audience for the great questions and sticking with us all morning. And next up will be our cyber lunch, sponsored by the good people at General Dynamics and General Hyten. And I'll turn it over to the good captain now.
Thank you. So first, thank you again to all panel members for your thoughts and ideas about cyberspace and ideas on collateral damage. And ladies and gentlemen, we'd now like to invite you to join us in the International Center for the Cyber 1.3 Luncheon, sponsored by General Dynamics, starting at noon. Thank you.